Here in this video, we're going to go through how to build your overhead budget using LMN's budgeting software. Stick with us because we're almost done. Once you're done the overhead budget, you're basically done your budget. And after this, you're going to analyze it and look at your P&L and some overhead recovery methods. But you've done all the heavy lifting up until now. Put your best effort into this budget. It may be that you've gone through the other ones already and you're getting a little sick of throwing numbers at the screen, but that's okay. Stick with us and do this budget justice. Overhead is a huge expense for most companies, just as much as labor or often materials. Not knowing your overhead and simply guessing or hoping that it's covered in the prices you choose your jobs is, from a business perspective, suicide. It's like not estimating your material costs and just, hoping they're covered at a blind guess at how much materials are going to cost. You wouldn't do that with materials. I hope you're not doing that with labor, and you certainly shouldn't be doing it with overhead. There's just way too much left to chance. So take your time, stick with us through this overhead budget. We'll show you how to build it, and you'll end up pricing jobs for the rest of the year with far more accuracy than you've ever had before. So far, if you've been working with us through the videos, we've built budgets for all the typical job costs. And when we say job costs, what we're really saying is estimated costs. All the costs so far that we've entered, we're going to recover directly in our estimates. These include costs like field labor wages, equipment costs, equipment rental costs, material costs, and subcontractor costs. These are all costs that estimators should be able to calculate for a specific job. But what estimators struggle to calculate is the overhead part of the costs. And overhead costs include things like rent and office management wages, cell phones, utilities, insurance, bank and professional fees, all the costs that you really can't just isolate for a specific job. So once again, you've probably got a lot of your overhead numbers from your profit and loss statement from the previous year, but don't just enter exactly what you spent last year. Use them as a guideline, sure, but make sure you're adjusting them for this coming year. If you're giving staff in your office a raise, if you're buying another vehicle for the office, if you're expanding your shop or yard, these are costs you have to consider when you're building your overhead budget, and make sure you build it all in as realistically as possible for this coming year. There's also a bunch of common mistakes we see when people are building their overhead budgets. So we thought before we jump into the budget, we just take a few minutes and go through the 6 biggest mistakes to make sure that you don't make them when you're building your overhead budget. The first, and maybe even the most common mistake, is ignoring owner's salary. There's lots of owners who don't pay themselves maybe a set salary. Their accountant gives them a more creative way to take draws out of the business or whatever. And that's fine. If that's what your accountant tells you to do, keep doing it. But that doesn't change the fact that you should budget yourself a salary. If you don't build a salary for yourself in your overhead budget, then it's not going to be built into your pricing. And if it's not going to be built into your pricing, it's probably not going to be there at the end of the year either. Remember too that business profit isn't to pay the owner's salary. A business should be able to pay the owner's salary and make a profit. And if you want to take some of that profit as more salary, then all power to you. But make sure you've budgeted yourself a fair salary. Think of your role in the business. If next week you couldn't work in the business for whatever reason, and you had to hire somebody to do what you do, you'd have to pay them a salary. That's the salary at least you should budget for yourself. Then on top of that, you should also be rewarded for having all your money and risk in running the business. And that's what profit is to help compensate you for as well. Profit can be used to help grow the business, to help reward the owner, to reinvest in equipment and other capital. But if you haven't made any profit, none of that'll be there. And one way to make sure that the business is making profit is to make sure that the owner's got a salary budget in there before profit. The next biggest mistake we see is people double entering their payroll taxes. So they'll enter in their overhead budget, payroll tax and unemployment insurance and workers' comp, because that tends to be where it is in accounting. Most accounting has it in overhead. Now, if you re-enter your payroll taxes here, you're going to double count them, because remember, when we did the field labor burden back in the field labor budget, we already tried to calculate a percentage that would cover all these costs, and it's built into your budget already. So you don't need to re-enter these. You also don't even need to enter them for overhead staff. There is a field labor burden percentage on this overhead budget that'll calculate that for them as well. So you don't need in your overhead budget payroll taxes, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, and any other things you counted as field labor burden. Mistake number 3, forgetting overhead equipment. So because we went to the equipment budget, we built your equipment list, many people forget about overhead equipment. Or perhaps you entered some of your overhead equipment in the budget. And if so, no worries, you can easily hit the action button and transfer it to overhead in just a few seconds. Things that belong in the overhead budget when it comes to equipment include things like the owner's truck, if the owner's truck isn't actually working jobs day to day. Office cars or vehicles, so if your salesperson has a car or vehicle, or the owner's wife has a car or vehicle. Yard and shop vehicles, so if you've got a loader that works at your yard and really doesn't ever go out to jobs, it's an overhead expense if you need to replace that loader, and it should be in your overhead budget. The 4th biggest mistakes are companies just re-entering their entire fuel and repairs. Again, that's usually because a lot of companies have those costs in overhead, and when you're going through it, you sort of lose track of where you are and you just re-enter them here. Remember, we covered most of, if not all of, your fuel and repairs in the equipment budget. Now, you should set aside some fuel and repair to cover the cost of fueling and repairing the overhead vehicles and equipment. So some of the fuel probably goes in the boss's truck or in the salesperson's vehicles or in any yard or shop equipment as well. So make sure you've got some fuel and repair and overhead, but not all. Most companies average about 20 to 25% of their fuel and repair costs for overhead vehicles, but not much more. Item number 5, or mistake number 5, is counting depreciation. So because a lot of companies are entering these costs off their P&L, there's usually a line in there called depreciation, sometimes called amortization, and that's what the accountant uses to depreciate equipment and vehicles. What you need to do is just throw this line out. Your accountant's interpretation of depreciation is probably legal, but also getting creative in the sense to help you pay the least amount of tax. We covered this in the equipment budget. Now, when you entered equipment in the equipment budget, you entered the cost to replace it, the years you'd keep it, and what it'd be worth at the end. In a sense, that is your depreciation. That's exactly what you're budgeting for when you built your equipment budget and when you put overhead equipment in your overhead budget. So you don't need your depreciation line item from your accountant. If you enter it, you'll just be double costing the depreciation on your equipment. So best not to enter it at all. And mistake number 6 is taking a shortcut. We know that most of the people watching these videos aren't the people that like to sit behind their computers and just bang numbers into a screen. If you are, pat yourself on the back and you're probably having a pretty good time so far. If you're not, you're probably tempted by now to take a shortcut and just bang this in as quickly as possible. We urge you, take your time and do your budget right. Just a couple hours spent now, maybe even just half an hour spent now, is going to help you ensure that you've got a year's worth ahead of you of accurate pricing in your jobs. And whatever time you put into building your overhead budget is going to be well worth it when it makes sure that every single job that you price from this point forward is more accurate than it's ever been. So let's get started on the overhead budget. The first place you're going to want to start is labor burden. And this makes sure that we build in, again, just like the field labor budget, the cost of payroll tax, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, etc., for overhead staff. Now, many companies use the same labor burden as the field labor burden because that's just the way they calculated it. They took their total payroll, their total burden, divided the two, and that's going to give you an average labor burden across the whole company. If you really want to get specific, your labor burden for overhead staff is probably lower because your workers' comp is probably lower. So that said, you could pay attention to that when you're building your overhead budget. But if you did calculate it, including your whole company, like all your payroll versus all your burden, then that number that you used in your field payroll is actually an average across the whole company and will work just fine for your overhead as well. Let's look now at how to enter overhead expenses into your budget. Just like we did with all the other expenses, we're going to slide over here to the new button. Before we do that though, notice I've got 3 areas of the overhead budget: overhead expenses, overhead wages, and overhead equipment. I'm going to start with overhead expenses. These would be general expenses for the company's operating, like rent, insurance, cell phones. Remember again, overhead expenses are all the expenses that you don't count when you estimate jobs. So if I'm going to add an expense like advertising, I'm just going to do this. Click the new button. If I have an ID number for advertising, like 65,000, I can enter that. But if you don't have ID numbers, again, you can skip those. I'll enter the cost of advertising, and then I'm going to enter what we spent on advertising last year versus what we're going to spend this year. You can enter comments if you want to describe why it's going up or down, but you don't need to. You can click the Save button when you're done. Now we're going to go to the next one, and maybe this one's going to be rent. Last year, maybe we had 25,000 in rent, and this year, rent's not expected to go up or down, so I'm going to keep them the same and hit Save. Now you're going to repeat this process for all your overhead expenses. Go through the list in your accounting of what your overhead is and enter what you spent last year versus what you're going to spend this year. Remember again that you're forecasting your overhead. Your forecast shouldn't just be an exact match of last year. It might be in many cases, but make sure you're at least thinking about it to remember if it's going to change or not. Let's take a look now at some of the other things you can do. The action button will give you two actions. One, move to materials. So if by accident you entered something in your overhead budget that actually belongs as a material, you can use move to materials. You can also delete using the action button by going action delete. If you need to change anything, obviously you can just jump right in that line, make your change, and then click off it. Now that's how you enter your overhead expenses. Now let's take a look at how to enter overhead wages. Click the Overhead Wages tab to enter your wages, and then go over here and click New. One of the mistakes we see most often is owners forgetting to budget themselves a wage. So I'll put that in here. We're going to go New, and I'm going to enter owner's salary. Now, just to remind you, even if you don't actually draw a formal salary, that's okay. You still need to budget for yourself what you think you deserve to make for running the business. Industry averages range around 8 to 10% of gross sales as a fair owner's salary. That's like saying if you had a company that did $700,000 in sales, the owner should be able to draw $70,000 as a salary out of the business, 10% of sales. Now, as your company gets larger and larger, that percentage starts to shrink. You're going to start needing to hire other more highly paid people to help you run that business, and then the percentage starts to go down a bit. But if you're making 6 to 8% of a $2.5 million business, you're still doing great. So here we'll enter last year. We made $65,000, but this year I want to pay myself $75,000. So I'll enter it like that and click Save. Now, remember back in the field labor budget, we had this operations manager who sometimes worked in the field, sometimes worked in overhead. I'm going to click the field labor budget just to remind you and click on salary field staff. And you'll see I'd entered an operations manager at 500 hours a year, which is 1/4 of his hours, and 1/4 of his annual salary of $50,000. So what I need to do is enter the rest of the salary that I haven't budgeted for in the overhead budget. When we did this field labor budget, we said the operations manager made about $50,000 a year. So what we did is we took 1/4 of $50,000 and we put it in this budget. What I need to do now is take the remaining 3/4 and put it in our overhead budget. So I'm going to go back to overhead, hit new, and put operations manager. Now I'm also going to put a note, 1,500 out of 2,000 hours. So I remember why I only put a portion of the salary in this budget. Now the previous might have been 37.5, and this year will be 37.5. And in the comments, I'm going to put C field labor for 1/4 of wages and hours. That's just going to remind me some of the operations manager's time is in our field labor budget. It's a great habit to get into, putting the notes so you're not looking at this next year wondering why isn't it the full salary. Then you'd continue through this, and maybe you've got an office manager who works part-time. And last year they made 18, and this year you're going to bump up our little raise. So I'll put a note about that as well, and I'll save that. And that's exactly how you're going to build overhead wages in your overhead budget. You can also use the action button to transfer somebody to labor. So if you accidentally put somebody in overhead that should be in the labor budget, all you need to do is click action and say move to labor. Or you can delete them from here as well. Now we want to look at how to enter overhead equipment. So I'm going to click on the tab for overhead equipment. And it's going to be just like we entered equipment in the equipment budget. So going over here, I'm going to click new. And I'm going to type owner's truck. Now remember, overhead equipment is the equipment that you don't think about when you estimate. We're going to say the owner's truck doesn't work day to day on jobs. So we're not going to make sure, or we're going to make sure that owner's truck is here in overhead and not in the equipment budget. So as a class, we're going to use owned or financed, depending on how you own or finance the owner's truck. Here we'll say the owner owns it. So I'll pick owned. Let's say the truck costs $60,000. The owner likes to keep his trucks for about 4 years before he gets a new one. And at the end of the 4 years, we'll probably still get about $22,000 for it on the open market. We'll say the owner uses it 12 months a year, and we'll use 1% as our inflation rate and hit done. So what we've now done is build an annual budget to replace that owner's truck every 4 years with a $65,000 truck. Now, if I had any other equipment like a operations manager truck, I'll put that in as well. Let's say we lease this truck, just to look at the difference. We'll go financed here. And let's say the operations manager's truck has a monthly lease of $575. So I'll just type $575 in there. I'll leave all these at 12 payments a year, hit done, and hit save. And now the operations manager's truck is in there as well. And we'll just repeat this for any other overhead equipment you may have, which might include things like yard and shop equipment as well. Now, once you've gone through these three things, you know exactly how to build an overhead budget. It should take you a little bit longer than we spent here, as you're going to go through your overhead expenses especially and go one by one through those. Most companies have somewhere between 10 and 50 overhead expense accounts. You're probably finding yourself somewhere in the middle of that. So build in your overhead expenses, and that way you'll have a complete overhead budget. We do strongly recommend that you don't just lump all your overhead together as overhead. Although that's nice from a time perspective, and it'll take you a lot less time to build this, it makes making changes in forecasts different. So put yourself 6 months ahead of right now, and let's say you've got an advertising opportunity that comes up. You wonder, is it worth it? One thing you could do is add to your advertising and then figure out how much more work do I need to sell to make that advertising worth it. So you can play around with your budget with scenarios. If you've lumped all your overhead together into one number, it's really hard to remember what you've changed and what you haven't changed and what you've adjusted to play around with. It's a lot easier if you keep it broken down. So we'd recommend that you take the time to break your expenses down and enter them in one at a time. And it really shouldn't take you longer than maybe half an hour top. Now, overhead budget can be tricky, but don't let it stump you. We're here to help. If you got any questions about overhead or how to build your overhead budget, please email us at support@golmn.com or use the live chat button, and we'll be happy to try and answer the questions to the best of our abilities.